Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. What does Vladimir Putin want? It's a question we've tried to ask several times on this program with limited success. Our next guest says we should actually take him at his word. He really does want to go back to Cold War boundaries. And furthermore, he says the West is going a long way to let the Kremlin have its way. Our guest is Keir Giles, a senior fellow at Chatham House and an analyst with the Conflict Studies Research Centre. Hello and welcome, Keir.
Hello, Nicholas. Good evening.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just a brief word for everyone who's tuned in. Judy Dempsey, who was scheduled to join this session, is unable to attend. Unfortunately, there's been a family illness and she's had to go somewhere at a very, very short notice. So she sends her apologies, but we're going to have an extremely full session with Keir here. Many, many questions, and I think some questions that might remain unanswered. Who knows? Let's see. Just to recap the situation, Keir, overall, what's the current situation in Ukraine? Can you just tell us about the number of forces Russia's deployed and also Russia's latest position in terms of what it's asking?
Well, in terms of what Russia has lined up against Ukraine, it's changing all the time. You may have seen different estimates in the press for how many thousands of troops Russia has actually deployed all the way around Ukraine, around its northern, eastern, and southern flank in Crimea as well, ranging from 100,000, 170,000, 175,000. The numbers aren't actually all that important. It's the process that we're seeing, and that is Russia gradually building up the capability to mount a massive invasion of Ukraine should it want to. And that process is continuing. We're seeing it all the time. Russia is keeping the pressure up on Western decision makers by bringing in troops from all the way across the country, by bringing in units that are stripped from the Chinese border, from the Arctic, and then stockpiling the equipment and bringing the people to meet them. So this force has been growing since about October last year, and it's still growing now. And that is what it got everybody focused on what it is that Russia is actually demanding. And it may seem like this is a pretty fast-moving situation, but actually very little has changed since about the middle of November, which was the first time President Putin laid out what Russia wanted and why exactly it was doing this, why exactly it was, as we've heard said a lot, holding a gun at Ukraine's head. What Putin said in the middle of November was that we have got them, meaning the West, into a certain state of tension with our warnings, and we need to keep them there for as long as possible. And that's precisely what they have done by maintaining this buildup, by drip feeding fresh news of a greater threat to Ukraine building all the time. And then the treaties, the draft treaties that Russia's put forward with effectively its list of demands on the West, coming out shortly before Christmas and widely compared to Putin's Christmas wish list. It's not just about Ukraine, although that's been the focus for most people looking at it from the West. It's actually covering the whole of Eastern Europe. They're often described as Russia demanding security guarantees for themselves, but actually it's the opposite. What Russia really wants is for security guarantees to be taken away from everybody else. And all of the protections that NATO and to some extent the EU have offered to Eastern Europe since the mid-1990s should be stripped back, and effectively NATO should be rolled back along with the clock to the end of the Cold War. So really what Russia's looking for is a return to 1914, when the only person that actually held sway over Eastern Europe was Russia.
It's a fascinating turn of events. And as you say, your overall point is that this isn't really about Ukraine, although Ukraine might be at the brunt of it. There's a very significant shift that has taken place with Russia's outlook. And the buildup of troops is really part of a sort of bargaining process. And can you just describe how this evolution has taken place? I mean, obviously, we're all familiar with what's happened in Syria, Georgia before that, Crimea. How do you think the Kremlin has changed, or Putin has changed in becoming so much more assertive than even, let's say, 10 years ago?
Well, that's exactly right. And a shift in outlook is a very good way to put it. It's been really quite sudden. It's only about 6 months ago that we saw a sudden change in strategic mindset from Russia, because up until that point, everything that Russia did, if you wanted to, you could interpret it as being defensive, as being inspired by this mistaken idea of threat from the West that they have, and trying to resist the challenges that they see not from NATO itself particularly, but from Western institutions, from free markets, from democracy, from everything that poses a threat to the Russian state order. So they would be beating back these security challenges where they saw them. Even events like the seizure of Crimea or the move into Syria in late 2015, they were actually inspired by Russia looking at a security situation that was getting rapidly worse from their point of view and seeing the need to step in and stop it happening. Ukraine's aspirations to have a closer trading relationship with the EU in 2013, 2014 was interpreted by Russia as NATO making a grab for Crimea, so they had to get there first. In Syria, they saw a repeat of the disastrous intervention of Libya looming. And so, again, they decided they had to get there first.
So it's reactive. That's the main point. Although we might think of them as being very aggressive and having a very different worldview, the point from the Russian perspective, it's reacting to events, trying to defend their own interests.
Very often, yes. The inspiration behind it is a reaction to a challenge that they see. And even when they are being undeniably aggressive and doing damage for no particular reason abroad, such as when they're carrying out their campaign of assassinations or sabotage in Eastern European nations, there's always an attempt at least to deny it. There's an attempt to cover up this and try to pretend that it's nothing to do with Russia. All of that has been discarded in the last 6 months, and instead they're moving over to the offensive. They are no longer attempting deniability. They're no longer seeking to defend themselves. Instead, they have set their own strategic objectives and then are pushing out to reach them. And you see this in a series of actions towards the back end of last year, where suddenly Russia no longer cares. It no longer cares about how it's seen in the rest of the world. Think about the way Russia was leveraging Europe's gas price crisis to try to force through its Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or the way it completely cuts ties with NATO, so there's no way for NATO and Russia to communicate any further, or the launch of an anti-satellite weapon. Russia's been working very hard to try to develop capabilities to destroy Western communication satellites, and a very destructive test of one of those, which causes hazards for all kinds of space operations, regardless of how that was seen in the rest of the world, was carried out in late November. Just another symptom of Russia simply not caring anymore what people think and setting what it wants to achieve and then going for it. And that's the context which you see these demands with menaces that we've got at the moment.
Has that sort of coincided? I mean, it would seem to me that Russia's much more competent and self-confident militarily than it used to. So I'm just wondering if there's been a sort of this military development has gone alongside, what comes first, the chicken and egg scenario there, if you like?
Well, that is a huge part of it, of course, because one of the ways in which Russia is a very 19th century country with a 19th century outlook is it measures its status and its power by raw military strength. And of course, that confidence in that raw military strength took a huge knock in the armed conflict with Georgia in 2008, because although Russia won convincingly, that showed up a huge range of deficiencies in the Russian armed forces. So for the decade after that, Russia was throwing huge quantities of money, energy, and resources and people at actually fixing their armed forces, a massive modernization program which effectively wiped out the organizational structure of the army and rebuilt it from scratch. Now, the interesting thing is the term date for that program, the term date for many of Russia's aspirations and its strategic documentation for where it wanted to be was 2020. In other words, they thought they were supposed to be ready for a conflict with the West just over a couple of years ago. So the coincidence with when that is supposed to be satisfactory from Russia's point of view in terms of the balance of power and the balance of forces with Europe and the United States, and when Russia starts this program of really being very assertive in pushing back for what it wants to recover in terms of former status, is pretty close.
We're going to look at the sort of military calculations in a bit, but as we say, the more important questions really are about its ability to influence events in Europe and the ability to sort of push NATO back and being able to assert itself more generally. But can you say what it's achieved so far just in this process of this military buildup?
Well, at the very early stage, when the demands were first set out, there was a suspicion, pretty widespread suspicion among people looking at it from the West, that it was just a bluff. It was just a cover. All of the demands that Russia was putting forward were so ridiculous that they would be instantly rejected, and this would provide the excuse for the invasion into Ukraine, which they were obviously planning anyway. But that overlooked a few features that Russia was probably counting on when it presented these demands. That although they might be ridiculous and although they might be unrealizable in some instances, Russia has had a past history of having its demands enforced by the Western powers that are supposed to be resisting it. And we see this repeated again and again when Russia enters or threatens to enter an armed conflict. The Western powers are so keen to end it or to prevent it that they will accept more or less anything because they prioritize ending a conflict over winning the war, which is what Russia wants to do. We've seen that happen in Georgia in 2008 with a ceasefire agreement imposed on the victim side by, at that time, French President Nicolas Sarkozy. We've seen it in Ukraine with the successive Minsk agreements that are completely unworkable, but insisted on by, this time, France and Germany. And we saw it in Syria, where, again, the victim side has to accept terms because they're imposed by, in this case, the United States. So Russia had a good reason to suspect that actually the same thing would happen again. There's the threat of a conflict, and therefore Europe in particular will give Russia something of what it wants. And even a partial acceptance of some of those treaty terms would be disastrous for Europe, but a huge triumph for Russia.
Just before we go on there, isn't that just a recognition of what the facts on the ground that Russia has created? I mean, you're not going to see proxy forces removed from Donbass. Georgia got defeated, substantially. Russia could have walked into Tbilisi. Likewise, in Syria, Russia was able to change the facts on the ground. So isn't it's basically Western reticence to get involved? Russia moves in; it can do what it wants.
All of that is true, except that it would be possible, if it were not for the insistence of each of these Western powers on ending the conflict as rapidly as possible, to actually look for a more equitable ceasefire. And the problem with Georgia was that for all of the period since 2008, everybody's been complaining that Russia has been violating the ceasefire agreement. But in fact, Russia is behaving exactly as it wrote down in the ceasefire agreement. And it's just the way in which it was wishfully interpreted by the West at the time was completely unrelated to what was actually written down there. And that might sound very familiar. If so, it's because that pattern has repeated as well. So yes, it is often a reflection of the fact that Russia is winning, but then it's the eagerness of the Western powers to actually help Russia win as rapidly as possible that ends up with unmanageable situations afterwards.
Okay, so you're seeing a sort of pattern of encouragement with the West failing to respond assertively to Russia that allows it gives us a more permissive environment and basically encourages Russia to take more aggressive or military action in many circumstances.
Because it works, yes.
Yeah, because it works. What is Russia's calculation of Western thinking? I mean, that's actually a very big label, if you like. And is there sort of miscalculation? I mean, I would think that people in the Kremlin have got a pretty good understanding of how Western democracies work, but your assertion is perhaps not.
It doesn't look that way. Now, we've seen repeatedly when Russia tries to strike a deal with the West that it thinks the West works in the same way Russia does. And everything that we aspire to in terms of democracy and equality is actually just a sham. It's really run behind the scenes by dodgy backroom deals. And that's the approach that Russia tries to take in all cases when trying to reach some kind of accommodation with the West. Now, in this particular case, if you look at how Russia is presenting its demands on Europe, it's presenting them to the United States because it assumes that the US actually runs Europe, and the US also runs NATO. It fails completely to grasp that, for example, NATO is a consensus organization where everybody gets a voice. and that the West actually treats these countries of Eastern Europe that Russia thinks are just colonies as independent nations with their own right to say what their future is. Now, in a way, Russia has achieved something by the fact that the US has bought into this framing of the argument that it's the future of Europe is a deal to be done by the great powers over the heads of the people who are actually living there. And of course, for people living in Poland or countries up and down those frontline states, that has really disturbing echoes of the 20th century when exactly the same process happened and they had no say in their future. So that's something that they want to push back as hard as possible. But meanwhile, the US is continuing this conversation with Russia about the future of NATO.
Yeah, at the same time, you see the US Secretary of State Blinken saying that Russia will not have a veto over NATO membership, and there's no way that troops are going to be removed from those frontier states. And if Russia does something, and actually it's not the situation is going to be worse. They'll be arming Ukrainians possibly and reinforcing their troops along Russia's borders. So there is some pushback. What are the circumstances in which Russia might come to the conclusion that it's not going to get what it wants?
Well, you're right. Now, Russia has only achieved a partial success. They've got the conversation going that they want. They've got the recognition of themselves as effectively an equal to the US that assuages their status anxiety, which drives so much of Russian actions. What they haven't got is an indication that they might have been hoping for, that there will be some kind of concession on these demands to effectively denude Eastern Europe of military protection. That hasn't happened yet. Now, Russia's been trying to force the pace all along. It's been threatening that it needs an immediate response or there will be some kind of, as President Putin put it, military technical action. But it's been 3 months now, and that hasn't happened. Russia's still building up its forces threatening Ukraine, and it's still pointing at that as the main challenge for the West and the main thing that the West ought to be focusing on. But they haven't been used, and a lot of military analysts think the time during which they could be used, specifically against Ukraine, is running out. So you have a big divide at the moment between those who think that invasion of Ukraine, or we should say a new invasion of Ukraine, is inevitable, and those that are looking around for other options that Russia might take in order to register its displeasure, to force through these demands, to reinforce them by demonstrating the kind of damage that Russia can do if its demands are not met. Because after all, the only way Russia makes itself relevant these days is through causing damage.
Okay, I mean, I'm going to use the analogy of the Grand Old Duke of York. I mean, he's marched the troops to the top of the hill. If he marches them back again, what has he gained at the moment?
There's a lot of people are thinking that actually he has to come away from this with something. Putin has to have something positive to show from this enormous exercise and this enormous expenditure of time and energy and fuel and resources to keep the troops there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to move into Ukraine, because there are so many other things in so many other different domains of conflict that Russia could do against targets other than Ukraine. Because after all, as we mentioned at the very beginning, this isn't about Ukraine. Ukraine is just the tool. It's the stick that Russia can use to beat the West into giving it what it wants. Now, let's think about where some of those Russian troops that are ringed around the Ukrainian border actually are. They're not sitting exactly on the border. They're sometimes a couple of 100 kilometers back, and a significant proportion of them are actually closer to Belarus than to Ukraine. And we've already seen them starting to trickle into Belarus under the guise of exercises, something that's been expected for a long time. Russia consolidating its hold over Belarus by actually establishing a permanent military presence there. Now, that is actually a get-out clause for Putin. It's not the case that if he doesn't invade Ukraine, he suffers a massive loss of credibility, because if he succeeds in showing that he has secured Belarus against the encroachments of the evil West, that in itself is the kind of success that he could use to carry him forward to his scheduled re-anointment as president in 2024. Plus, of course, it would give NATO enormous new headaches, because then you have a new Russia-NATO frontier on Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, etc.
And you're saying that this isn't getting the airtime in Russia as it is in the West?
The way this has been presented in Russia is very, very different from how it's playing in the West, and that's not unusual to have an almost unrecognizable alternative reality in Russia itself. But it is interesting how exactly this particular aspect of the conflict with the West is being portrayed. Now, the war rhetoric inside Russia has been more or less constant for almost a decade now. Russians who watch state television are told constantly that they are in this confrontation with the West, which is likely to spill over into armed conflict any time. Now, you'd expect within that, if Russia was preparing its population for an armed assault on Ukraine, it might at least be mentioned. But no, instead, it's been very quiet and barely noticeable, except to people who take a keen interest in news beyond the borders of Russia.
So far, what we've been looking at is essentially a ruse to try and force concessions from NATO and from Western allies, and that Putin and the Kremlin think that they can exact concessions out of the West in that process, and they have done possibly so far just by the fact that they had been brought to the negotiating table. Let's explore the sort of doomsday scenario, the idea of military conflict. At what point does military conflict become worthwhile? And what do you think are the possible or likely scenarios?
So yes, it may simply be a ruse, but the point is the ruse has to be carried off so effectively that Russia, everybody agrees, does now have the capabilities to actually go ahead and do it if they wish to. And so you have to prepare for that accordingly, because the one thing that will precipitate a Russian move more reliably than anything else is to be unprepared and effectively to invite those troops in. Now, given what has been built up on the Ukrainian border, we've seen all sorts of very authoritative and plausible scenarios for what a new invasion might actually look like, from a limited land grab in the north to reinforcing Russia's control over the eastern provinces, or even a drive along the southern seaboard to join up Crimea with mainland Russia. But the one thing that most people seem to think is off the cards is a massive total onslaught to overtake the whole of Ukraine. Now, it's what we don't know is to what extent Russia would need to attack Ukraine in order to set up the proxy government that we hear it's been supporting inside Russia itself, ready for installation in Kiev at the right moment. Most people seem to agree that actually it would take far more than Russia is prepared to do with the sources that it actually has at its disposal at the moment, because you'd need a much larger armed force to actually take over Ukraine up to the borders, up to the outskirts of Kiev. But let's not forget that, as I said, they are still building up, and that force that is poised there is still increasing. So we don't know at what point exactly Russia might feel that it has that overwhelming force that it would need to actually push forward into Ukraine.
The other option you've referred to is remote strikes using sort of air bombardment and having sort of more sort of strikes you can sort of deploy a few days at a time. See what the reaction is, see what the reaction both is in Kiev, but also in Brussels among NATO, and then get reaction from what the West seeking some kind of mediation or truce.
That's exactly right. Everything that has been threatened to Russia, countermeasures and responses from the West, has been pinned to specifically an invasion. We hear from, I think it was Boris Johnson today, saying if one towcat goes over the Ukrainian border, then there will be some fairly pusillanimous reprisals. But the US has been threatening serious economic and military responses in the event of an invasion. Now that creates a powerful incentive for Russia to do something other than invade, because if you are setting this strict criterion for Russian escalation, why would Russia go ahead and meet it? And yes, it's exactly the kind of long-range cross-border air and missile strikes that Russia has been practicing in, for example, Syria, that would very effectively focus Western minds, again, on trying to bring the conflict to an end as quickly as possible. Because what Russia found in Syria was that, once again, terrorizing the civilian population into submission is the best way to win a war. So if you target humanitarian facilities like hospitals, kindergartens, bakeries, etc., with long-range missiles and with airstrikes, that tends to get you away pretty rapidly. And if you saw that spectacle playing out in Europe, then there's little doubt that it would get, again, European politicians scrambling to bring it to an end as rapidly as possible, more or less at any cost.
Let's bring in some questions in just a second. I'd love to hear from Howard Gatiss in a moment. He's got a question there. But in the meantime, Keir, what kind of justification would Russia give for this? It does seem incredible that this is that we think this is a real possibility, and then we'll come on to the idea of deterrence.
Yes, well, one of the striking features about how Russia is behaving at the moment is for a lot of the things they're doing, they don't feel the need to offer any justification. If you dig deep into the convoluted language that Russia is using to explain its objections to the way NATO has enlarged, to the way effectively Eastern Europe has security guarantees against Russia, there are two basic paradoxes at the bottom of it, or rather one misunderstanding and one paradox. The misunderstanding is everything Russia is doing is based around the assumption that people want to attack Russia. Now, it's true from time to time that has been true in Russia's past history, but it's projecting forward the experience of past centuries onto a completely different international environment today. And the other point, the paradox, is that Russia fails completely to understand that everything it's doing to try to prevent countries joining NATO actually shows them why it's a good idea to join NATO. Threatening Ukraine with military force to try to stop NATO enlargement proves exactly why countries want to join NATO, to protect themselves against threats of military force from Russia. So we are in this conundrum, and Russia has persistently failed to learn from all of its attempts to dissuade, for example, countries like Finland and Sweden, far away from Ukraine, from joining NATO, that everything they do has the exact opposite effect to what they want.
But then you've got to agree with ideas like self-determination and possibly democratic government, and that possibly doesn't suit the current leader of Russia. Howard, let's have your question. Go ahead, Howard.
We tend to use Putin and Russia interchangeably, and I guess we all know, or we think we know, what Putin wants, which is to go back to something like pre-1989, and when Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then, could be taken seriously. To what extent, if this is a reasonable question, to what extent does he have the full support of what in our country would call the cabinet? In other words, not only the military, but all of his other senior officials who have to face the consequences and pay for it and all the rest of it. And to what extent is there general support within the country? Or are those simply just not relevant questions and he's so all-powerful that he can do what he wants?
Well, yes, there are questions that are very important, but also irrelevant, unfortunately, because yes, we'd love to know what whether there were any dissenters within the Russian inner circle that influences President Putin's thinking. It doesn't look like it, because a lot of those people have been discarded a long time ago. Let's not forget, this is a country that sacked its finance minister for pointing out that the military reconstruction program was unaffordable. So from this process that we've seen of Russia moving closer and closer to aspiring to be a Soviet country once again, not with all the external trappings of communism, but Soviet in mindset, and also reaching deep back into Russian traditions of hostility to the outside world and to its own population, and how you manage both of those. What we've seen is the policy options being gradually discarded for actually having a real, sensible, cooperative relationship with the West and going down this track of conflict. And at the same time, we have to remember that when you're thinking about what the population at large thinks of all of this, as part of Russia's defensive measures against the imaginary threats from the West, it's also worked very hard at sealing itself off from the outside world in terms of information, trying again to go back to this Russian historical comfort zone where you don't get ideas and opinions from abroad, which will pollute the minds of your citizens and cause them to have doubt in what they're being told by state propaganda. Again, very much deep in the Russian tradition, a country that's banned the ownership and import of foreign books at times throughout history because they are so dangerous, and reacted to the invention of the photocopier, the fax machine, the internet in exactly the same way. Basically panic, because that is a means of distributing and transmitting information, and you lose control over information. So a lot of what Russia has been doing with the internet is all about regaining control and regaining those filters on what ordinary Russians see in the outside world. Meanwhile, bombarding them with the war propaganda, which, as I said, goes back a lot further than most people think. They've been at this for over a decade.
Keir, your analysis of the Kremlin and Russia is, it's a very clear one, and it's a very convincing one too. But what's less clear to me is the matters of deterrence. I mean, that's really why Europe is in such a confusion as to what to do. What measures can you take that actually deter Russia from this kind of actions? I mean, and we're not talking just about Ukraine. We're talking about poisoning people on the streets of Britain. The threats that have been used repeatedly over the last decade or so. So what actually works? What are you suggesting could work?
Well, it's a good idea to start with looking at what has not worked, because one of the driving factors of this this new confidence and this new assertiveness that Russia has is the military capability, as you mentioned. But the other is the complete failure of any other power to actually deter Russia from this path, because deterrence of all of the things that you mentioned and more has failed utterly. So nothing that has been done up until now has worked. And the core reason why it has not worked is a failure, or probably a refusal among Western powers, to actually recognize that Russia thinks it is at war with us and is behaving accordingly. And it is only once you accept that, which is a difficult and painful decision to make, that you can actually start structuring measures of deterrence accordingly. At the moment, we're still hearing from here in the UK about how the right thing to do would be to target the finances of those close to Putin that are, of course, salted away in London, and they come to visit them from time to time. That has been promised many times before. It's never actually happened. And part of the reason is because there is not this acceptance that you are in a conflict. And being in a conflict actually necessarily incurs costs. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be painful, but the alternative, of course, is far more expensive and painful, and you lose the war.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's take Diane Cook, and then we'll take Simon Eggleton, one after the other. We will combine those two questions. So go ahead, Diane, first, please.
Keir, today Tobias Ellwood, who, for those who are not in the UK, is a parliamentarian of the governing party and chairs, I think, the Defence Committee, and is also a former soldier. He was proposing that actually what NATO needs to do is to put troops into Ukraine, regardless of the fact that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and basically up the ante, as it were, I guess is what he was saying, to show the Russians that the West has, got some backbone. What do you think of that?
Okay, let's hold on for 1 second, and let's take Simon Eggleton as well. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, good evening. On a slightly different note, it's an expensive thing to have your troops mobilized and on the border, both in cost, in keeping them there, in housing them, feeding them, keeping them exercised. But also for morale in the cold. How long can Putin keep that up without doing more with them?
Okay, great. So let's deal with Tobias Ellwood's suggestion, putting UK troops in Ukraine.
Well, he has taken a
Sorry, it was NATO troops.
NATO,
so
NATO
I guess that might be UK, but who knows?
Yeah. Yes. We think that one of the biggest mistakes that were made early on in this crisis, in this drama, was both the US and the UK saying that they were not going to do that. Now, however realistic or unrealistic it might be to actually send British or American troops into Ukraine to face down the Russians, if you take that option off the table, it makes things so much more comfortable for Putin and the people around him to make decisions, because it removes a whole range of worst case scenarios from their planning and from their risk benefit calculus. So we see this tradition, coming back to the topic of deterrence, of Western powers being very willing to say what they will not do to protect their friends and their partners and their allies and themselves. And we think that is a repeated mistake. And when we think about the option of putting NATO troops into Ukraine under the current circumstances, despite Ukraine not being a NATO member, I think it's worth looking at the positive experience of what's happened in the Baltic states, where they host what NATO refers to as enhanced forward presence. It's a fancy name for a small number of servicemen from groups of nations in each of the 3 Baltic states and in Poland. The reason why this small number, despite not being militarily terribly significant, is actually so effective is because it brings in all of NATO to a confrontation with Russia rather than Russia thinking it can pick off one country at a time. In other words, you wouldn't put it to a debate within NATO about whether you were at war or not because you're already involved. Now, the result of that has been that the Baltic states in particular are the safest that they have been in centuries. Up until the EFP was actually deployed through 2015, 2016, after the seizure of Crimea, everybody's favorite scenario for Russia's next move was attacking the Baltic states. That conversation has completely stopped. It's off the table, and everybody recognizes that it is NATO that is a significant contribution to actually keeping the peace there. Now, there's no doubt that if NATO was able to actually do this, or rather had been able to do this some time ago, then that would have prevented the Russian buildup and the Russian threats from actually being implemented against Ukraine. The problem now is that it is probably too late, because as soon as you start doing that, you fulfill for Russia all of its prophecies about how Ukraine would actually be used as a means to move the Western powers forward and actually be in a position to strike at Russia. So the time to do that may well by now have passed, because if there's one thing that's likely to trigger a Russian invasion, it may well be Russia's suspicions and its paranoia actually being borne out in Western actions. But when we're faced with the same situation again, which we will be, whichever way this current confrontation over Ukraine goes, getting NATO or at least some partner nation presence there early in order that the target country is not left on its own would be a huge enabler for the West.
But the reverse argument of that is that if you commit yourself to a country that's not a NATO member, you possibly might not have the backing of all NATO allies. And isn't Russia's aim overall to prove the fallibility of NATO? And if there's disagreement among Greece, Hungary, and whoever about their using troops against Russia and not wanting that conflict, you've just proved how fallible NATO is.
It's true. It's going to be hard enough already to get everybody on side with whatever NATO does. And let's not forget, thinking back to those Baltic scenarios, one of the popular ways that people thought this might develop was precisely using, for example, Estonia in the way Ukraine is being used now, as a lever to actually drive that wedge in the West, to conduct some kind of threat, some kind of limited operation, and then watch NATO fall apart because it can't decide what to do. And that's the reason why you have coalitions of the willing being set up to bypass NATO and to actually get stuff done without having to put it to the vote of all of the members. There's the Joint Expeditionary Force, where the UK is the framework nation, and it brings together I think it's now 10 countries across the top of Europe. It's referred to as the Northern Beer Drinking Alliance, also including countries which are non-NATO states, Finland and Sweden. The purpose being to respond swiftly and appropriately without risking that NATO vote that, as you explained, could just go so very badly wrong.
Simon Eggleton's question was about how long can you keep troops there? At what point does it become self-defeating?
Well, Russia and Russia would certainly like us to think that it's no hardship being out in sub-zero temperatures in a tent with a stove, and to some extent the Nordic countries that practice it are actually agreeing with them. But yes, it's hugely expensive. It's massively draining on Russia's resources. And if some of the perishable resources, like, for example, the blood supplies that we're being told are being stockpiled by the border, are actually genuinely there, then yes, these are things that you won't get back. But we need to think about the return on investment that Russia might get from this, even if they don't invade. If they are granted some of their demands in the draft treaties, that's a huge reverse for NATO and a huge gain for Russia, and something which would certainly outweigh everything that they're currently investing in the deployment.
The point you make also is that if Russia is permitted, is able to basically use this kind of deployment to gain concessions, it's going to continue to do so. And you essentially talk about, if you don't deal with Russia, what's the example given to others such as China? And ultimately, you talk about the need to defeat Russia. Can you explain that?
Oh, yes, certainly. First of all, it is not just Russia that is learning from the current experience and will repeat it if it is successful. It's also other countries that will be gauging the willingness of the West as a whole to support not only its friends and its partners, but also the values that it says it stands up for. Does the West actually really believe in nations having their own sovereignty, having a free voice in determining their own future, or will it actually be willing to throw them under the bus when they're confronted with a powerful aggressor? And that's precisely the lesson that China will be looking at when it looks to how the West might respond to any move it might make against Taiwan. For example, everybody around the world that has territorial designs on its neighbors will be watching this to see how it plays out and see to what extent their suspicion that actually the United States is no longer in the game of protecting democracies and its partners around the world is actually going to be borne out. Now, the problem is, as soon as you recognize that you have failed to deter Russia and that the fight is on, then you have to respond accordingly. And that's where the transition from deterring to actually defeating Russia comes in. The problem is we're not at that point yet. We still think it's possible to buy off Russia instead of actually recognizing that you don't really get a choice when you're in a war with Russia or not. If they start it, then you're in and there's no option.
Okay, but I'm still, if there is a military conflict, I mean, what are the next? I mean, you've talked about sanctions, but I mean, I don't see, when you talk about defeating Russia, I'm still not clear as to what options there are and what I mean, it's a completely different game, isn't it?
This is over the long term. Yes, it is a completely different game. And what's essential is actually putting up a stop sign for Russia returning to where it wanted to be. And the problem is that Russia has not been challenged yet in its belief, first of all, that it has the right to dominion over Eastern Europe, and secondly, that military force is the appropriate way to get it, because everything it's heard so far is actually reinforcing that belief. And it's interesting to look at when Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is talking about those countries of Eastern Europe that they want to roll NATO back from, the language he uses about them. He says after the end of the Warsaw Pact, it became beskhoznaya, which is a word that's been translated into English as orphaned, but it could equally well be called masterless. And the thinking behind that is that these are not real countries in their own right. They need a master, and that master should, by rights, be Russia. And it is only by historical accident that it's actually the United States that is in charge of them at the moment. Now, that is a highly dangerous way of thinking for the rest of Europe. And it's one of those really uncomfortable parallels that we have at the moment between now and, say, 1938. When the aggressor is moving on territory, making his demands, making plain his aspirations to expand his territory. And the choice that's facing everybody else is, when exactly do we put a stop to this? Early on, when it's going to be difficult and painful, or later when it's going to be far, far worse?
Okay, that still leaves a question of how, but it's fascinating, huge question. Thank you. Bruce Clark, let's bring your question in now. Go ahead, Bruce.
My question is whether there has been, in your assessment, a quiet reordering of the Russian economy to make it more like a war economy. I mean, in the Soviet times, it used to be said that the Soviet Union didn't have a military-industrial complex. It was a military-industrial complex. In other words, it was taken for granted that the cream of human and material resources would always go to the military. And then that completely collapsed, of course, in 1990. And I wondered, has there been a quiet return to something like that situation? And if so, when did that start happening?
I think it's not been particularly quiet. Now, I'm not an economist, still less a defense economist, but the colleagues that I work with who watch this closely have been tracking this process at least since 2014, and in some instances starting beforehand, with the military overhaul starting in 2009, 2010. So they've been at it for quite a while. And in the same time, of course, they've been doing their best to sanction-proof their economy and to substitute for imports where sanctions are blunting the military development program. So yes, they're quite a long way down the track of preparing for conflict, including some of the very Soviet-style mobilization reserves being built up again in the very kind of old-fashioned 20th century way. Yes, there are echoes here of what we've seen in past iterations of the Russian Empire, but at the same time, one of the really important things that we've seen people get wrong in assessing this process in Russia from the outside is there's been an assumption that it's unaffordable, that Russia is going to spend so much on its military that actually it's not going to continue to function as a state. Now, Putin has made it very plain and appears to be sincere in this, that they're going to avoid that mistake this time. They're not going to repeat the experience of the 20th century and centuries before it, when Russia repeatedly spent itself into state collapse trying to pursue a war, 1917 and 1991, and pretty close in 1905. Putin has said specifically, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep it affordable. We're going to manage the economy in such a way that the military burden does not torpedo it completely. And although defense spending has been huge, it has been under control. It's tapered off now that the most expensive phase of reorganizing and rebuilding and rearming Russia's military has already been achieved. It's over. So now they're in much more of a care and maintenance than an innovation phase, just keeping those capabilities going, keeping mass production of the new weapons going, as opposed to instituting new capabilities. So put it all together, and yes, you have a situation where they are ready for conflict. They have been working on being ready for conflict in the economy as well for over a decade, and it's not looking as though that is going to cripple their economy.
I will ask the question later. You know, once you've got it, there's a temptation to use it in terms of that new sort of military power. Let's take a question from Anna Logan first, though. Please go ahead, Anna. Anna, you just need to open your microphone if you're there. There you go. Go ahead.
From what I've seen.
Go on. You had it there, Anna. Go on. Open the microphone again. So I'm going to ask your question for you. It says that you say that it appears that the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is keeping his cool and saying that the West is possibly overreacting to the situation. Why is he reacting in this way?
Yeah. Yes, we've heard him repeatedly say, let's not cause a panic, and to play down these assessments that you hear from the US and the UK about the imminence of a huge military assault. And in fact, that's reflective of a divide, not just Ukraine, but also Europe and the US and the UK, because it's very much been the Americans that are driving this idea that, yes, an invasion is definitely going to happen, and it's on the cards more or less immediately. Why is Zelensky playing it down? Well, in part, most people suspect he does not actually want to spark panic in his own population by whipping up those fears and putting them in those same terms that the Americans do, which is highly alarming. Another suspicion is that although the US is looking at what it sees from above and the long-term trends of building up these capabilities, Ukraine may actually have a different assessment based on its intimate knowledge of how Russia works. But another aspect, again, to it is the fact that to much of the outside world, this looks like a new problem. But for Ukraine, it's actually just another escalation in a war that has been ongoing now for not that far off a decade. So it is something with which they have been dealing all along, and something which they are as prepared as they can be.
Jim Lowenstein. Go ahead, Jim.
I have been mystified by this whole business because Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, knows the United States extremely well and is regarded by many as the shrewdest foreign minister now in office today in any country. He must have known that it was impossible for the United States to meet the demands of that Russian draft treaty. And so I don't understand why they went ahead and proposed something that they knew would be rejected. It didn't seem to me that that was a very good negotiating tactic.
Well, I do think that there may have been a belief in some areas of not even necessarily the Russian foreign policy establishment, because after all, they don't make the decisions, but the Russian security establishment that may have thought that it would get something out of this. Now, it's true, if you look at the fine detail of what's actually demanded in the treaty, some of it is not just not within the rights of the United States to give. It's actually technically impossible. They say remove NATO troops from countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, overlooking the fact that, of course, those militaries are NATO troops. So, effectively, they're asking for a complete demilitarization of Eastern Europe. A lot of it is unworkable. All of it should be unacceptable. And yet it's being forced through. And I suspect the answer in terms of how Sergei Lavrov is feeling about this is a theory that's been put forward by a good friend and colleague Mark Galeotti for some time now, that Lavrov has effectively given up trying to have any opinions of his own, is acting under orders, and will repeat whatever he is told to repeat with a straight face, regardless of whether he thinks it's viable.
But doesn't that work the other way, Keir, in that you can say, right, they've refused to accept our demands, therefore we are taking these actions. And then you get into the scenario where the West is faced with a military accompli and then has to react and then compromises.
That's certainly how it was presented in the early stages, that the demands were so unworkable and unacceptable that it must just be a cover, it must just be an excuse for imminent military action. But that was getting on for 3 months ago, and nothing has yet happened. You rather think that given the wide range of options that Russia has, and let's not forget, not limited to Ukraine, because there are plenty of other ways that Russia can cause harm and cause damage to Europe, something would have happened by now if Russia was as sincere as it was pretending to be about there being an imminent threat that would force the pace.
Let's bring in a question from Howard Gatus. You've got another one there, Howard. Go ahead, Howard.
Keir, you said a few moments ago that one of the things that Russia has done in recent years is try to reduce its dependence on imports. In other words, to be more resistant to non-military pressure from the West. One of the things that seems to be suggested, and obviously this would be down to the US, would be excluding Russia from dollar-based transactions, taking them out of the SWIFT system and so on. And if I'm right, and I might be wrong, that this was something that they either did or threatened to do with Iran, with, you could argue, a certain amount of success. That's for another day. Is that a possibility? And despite the fact that Russia has put up some ways of avoiding financial pressure from the West, that could be the one which would have an effect?
Well, yes, but taking Russia out of SWIFT is the option that's always been presented as in effect the last resort. Ever since we first started hearing about the range of possible sanctions in 2014, it's always been in the background. It's always been mentioned as something which is theoretically possible, but would cause so much disruption in the West as well that it's really not desirable unless it's absolutely essential. So, in theory, yes, it could be done. In theory, the exclusion of Russia from secondary debt markets, the exclusion of Russia from using dollars in all of the different ways that are on the table would be possible. But it's the willingness of Western countries to actually bear the cost that would entail that is probably the limiting factor there. And also, in that respect, as in so many other ways of sanction-proofing its economy, Russia has taken some steps towards mitigating the impact, towards actually making sure that it is less dependent on international financial systems. Now, again, I'm not an economist, but the ones I trust tell me that that would soften the blow a little, but it would still be extremely expensive for Russia's economy overall. But I come back to the point about how Russia recognizes and insists, in fact, that it is already fighting a war in every domain except open military conflict. And when they do that, there are certain costs that they are willing to bear because they think it will bring victory.
Keir, we've got to face up to the fact that you are, you make a very good argument, but essentially within the sort of European context, you stand out as a hawk. The reality is in France, but notably Germany, most voices are far more reticent to get engaged in any kind of conflict with Russia and would see concessions as a necessary part of it. And would prefer to go down that route. And also that means excluding sanctions, really.
Yes to all of that. Yes, I am. Yes, they would. It's not just me, strangely enough, on this occasion that is coming out as hawkish. It's actually the UK that has, slightly unexpectedly for some people, taken a bit of a leadership role in standing up for Ukraine and by proxy for the whole of Eastern Europe, by not only responding in the rhetoric and the politics and the diplomacy to Russia, but also responding in terms of practical measures for assisting Ukraine and raising the cost of a potential Russian invasion. And that is in stark contrast, as you say, to what's happening in France, in Germany, and the other major EU countries. And there's a perfect metaphor for what's going on in the way British deliveries of light anti-tank missiles, defensive weapons for supporting Ukraine's defensive potential, to Kiev had to route around Germany because the bureaucracy would have delayed them too much. And Germany, of course, is also blocking deliveries of weaponry from NATO allies to Ukraine. So yes, there's a very different approach on different parts of the continent. Really, for me, it comes down to a moral judgment. Do we actually stand by the values that we profess? And do we actually want to take ourselves seriously when we say that those frontline states that are now free democracies and full-fledged members of the Western communities, not just NATO and EU, but actually part of Europe, do we stand up for the fact that we actually want to protect them and keep them, as opposed to letting them go back to domination by Moscow and being kept in the condition which Moscow likes to keep its satellites and colonies in, not determining their own future, dependent on Moscow, impoverished, undemocratic, and rolling back the rule of law and everything that is currently making them prosperous nations. Now, I rather think that's actually worth making a stand for. And I also think, echoing what we mentioned, what we talked about a few minutes ago, that the sooner it is pointed out to Russia that it no longer has the right to dictate these terms to countries beyond its borders because the age of empires in Europe is over, the less expensive, the less painful, the less damaging it's going to be.
But the sad thing, perhaps, is that there isn't the consensus to back up what you want. If we look at Germany, for example, we talked about the supplying of British military equipment to Ukraine. Germany actually didn't give, then flight permission wasn't granted for them to go through German airspace. And so the RAF went around Germany in order to deliver those weapons. That's quite incredible. Senior German minister said, forget any consideration about Nord Stream 2 being cancelled. That has to remain in place. When it comes to the SWIFT mechanism that they were talking about withdrawing from Russia, Germany said, no way, that's not going to happen. So they weren't ready to implement that sanction. Russia can rely upon Germany not to take a hard line. Therefore, Europe is divided, and most of what you would like to happen is not going to happen.
Well, that depends. If you rely on Europe to make it happen, then certainly not, because yes, Germany and France are Russia's best allies within Europe. But what you've seen, particularly since Brexit, is the UK in particular able to actually forge its own foreign policy and take a more confrontational line, more in tandem really with the United States, and not having its policies and its responses hostage to Brussels and through to Berlin and Budapest. It doesn't take the whole of NATO to actually stand up to Russia. Now, that may sound paradoxical because the whole point of NATO is supposed to be that everybody stands together. But we will see circumstances where, not just in Ukraine, but in other countries as well, Russia does manage successfully to drive a wedge between them. And again, that's the reason why we have organizations like the GEF for working around that problem, but still facing down Russia where it needs to be done.
Keir, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much indeed. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been one of the best we've had so far. I think it takes me several steps closer to getting some understanding of Vladimir Putin. So thank you very much indeed for your time this evening.
Thank you.